Cawson from the University of Melbourne to talk about in-forest microclimates.
Thanks, Jack, and hello, everyone. I'm from the FLARE Wildfire Research Team based at the University of Melbourne. And my focus is on landscape flammability, so understanding how vegetation dynamics influence where and when forests will burn. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this work I'll be presenting today, and also pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Eastern Maar. So I come from a fire behaviour perspective, and from that perspective, very broadly, we see the landscape as a mixture of wet and dry eucalypt forests that behave differently in a bushfire context. So the wet forests are often too wet to burn, and importantly, they can act as a barrier to the spread of fire. In contrast, the dry forests are more frequently available to burn, and these are the ones that are typically targeted for prescribed burning. However, this difference in moisture and fuel availability between wet and dry forests varies over time with the changing weather conditions. And sometimes both the wet and dry forests are available to burn. And that coincides with our worst fire days because the entire landscape is connected and available to burn. So this is when we're seeing loss of life and human property. So understanding how fuel availability varies over the landscape is really important for preparing for those worst fire days and understanding fire risk across the landscape. But it's also really important for implementing planned burns when we might want to take advantage of the moisture differential so that we can end up with a more patchy burn outcome. And finally, it's important for modelling burn patchiness as part of a key input for modelling fire risk over time and looking at like climate change scenarios and looking at different management scenarios we might want to implement. So that brings me to the aim of the research I'll talk about today, which is broadly to predict when eucalypt forests will ignite and how this varies across the landscape. And this photo here is obviously not from the Otways, but I quite like it because it shows fire on one side of the slope and you've got snow on the other. So this is a little bit of a conceptual diagram of the different things we need to understand to answer that research question. And what we've been focusing our effort on is unpacking the variables in those orange boxes. And then the other words up there are just the key influencing factors. So we start our journey in the centre looking at ignitability, which in particular the probability of ignition. So predicting when these forests will ignite and what factors influence that. So our key question is, when will eucalypt forests ignite? And we've got a picture up there of a eucalypt forest, and I've shown you flaming firebrands dropping down into the forest, and we want to understand when those firebrands will ignite the fuel on the forest floor. And importantly, we want to understand which metrics best predict that. So we know fuel moisture is a really important factor influencing ignitability, but there's many different ways of measuring moisture. And so this project was looking at all those different variables and trying to work out which metrics are going to be most useful for us. So you don't need to read them all, but I've got all the metrics we looked at up there. There's some that you measure in forests. Directly, you might be measuring the moisture content of the fuel itself, or you might be measuring the microclimate inside the forest, beneath the forest canopy. And then there's a range of landscape moisture variables. Some of these have been around for decades and they're already used within our fire models. And some of them are a lot newer. They might be derived from satellites, or they might be calculated from process models, but they generally haven't been linked to fire behaviour. So we're testing to see whether or not some of these might be more useful than the traditional old metrics. So the project involved getting out into the forest and doing some ignitions. So we had a number of sites and we'd go out to those sites and do a number of point ignitions and then look at whether or not those points would continue burning. And we repeated that at the same sites under different weather conditions throughout the summer fire season to start to build a picture of which days those forests will ignite and which days they will not ignite and what the weather variables were at those times. This graph here, to cut a long story short, just shows the key variable that we found was important. And this was the dryness of the air inside the forest, which we call vapor pressure deficit. So you can see in that graph there, the probability of ignition increasing as dryness increases. So as the in-forest vapor pressure deficit increases. But what's really interesting is that we also found that the thresholds for ignition vary between forest types. And in fact, you need drier air inside the forest or drier atmospheric conditions for a wetter forest to ignite. So on the y-axis there, I've got that atmospheric dryness, VPD, from moist to dry, and the black line shows a 50% probability of ignition. And rather than that being flat and the same across all different forest types, it's sloping down. So when we move from a wet eucalypt forest to a dry eucalypt forest, we actually don't need it to be quite as dry for those dry forests to ignite. So that was a really interesting finding. And an important thing to note there is we've used this thing called aridity index as our proxy for forest type. So our model for ignitability has in-forest vapor pressure deficit and aridity index within it. So coming back to this diagram now, we've got a bit of a model to predict ignitability, but we can't actually model that across the landscape. So you can see I've got ignitability there, and we've got forest type or aridity index as one of the key predictors, but then also that in-forest atmospheric dryness. So the next step in the research is to try and model in-forest dryness. So at the moment, we can get from the Bureau of Meteorology a 5-kilometre gridded atmospheric dryness, but that doesn't tell us anything about what the conditions are like beneath the forest canopy and in different topographic positions across the landscape. So we've set up a whole bunch of weather stations across the landscape in different forest types, in different topographic positions to measure vapor pressure deficit, which you just calculate from temperature and relative humidity. And we used those weather station data in combination with that 5-kilometre gridded VPD product, which I can show you there, and also a range of topographic variables to predict your in-forest vapor pressure deficit. And you can see on this map here, we're seeing a lot more detail and topographic effect of dryness. And to zoom in a little more, you can see what we originally had with the Bureau of Meteorology product and then the much higher resolution that we're seeing now. So now we can start to see where perhaps we might have barriers to the spread of fire in the landscape. And a follow-up step to that was testing this model across a much wider landscape. So we started off just looking at a few forest types in the Yarra Ranges, and now we've moved out across the whole state, including the Otways, looking at drier forests as well, looking at areas with lower canopy cover to make sure that our in-forest vapor pressure deficit model works more widely across the landscape. And it turns out it's pretty good. In fact, broadly across the landscape, it was performed a little better than the original study where we developed the model. In the Otways, it's still pretty good, not as good as across the state, but pretty good in terms of ecological models. So now we can use this model to predict the probability of ignition at high resolution, at 20-metre resolution across the whole landscape. So we've got our maximum daily in-forest vapor pressure deficit combined with our aridity index, and that gives us the probability of ignition. Now, what does that look like? Well, here's a map of the Otways, 28th of December 2019, and you can see how the probability of ignition varies across the landscape on those days. So you've got those red areas where there's a high chance that if there was an ignition source, a fire could start, but then you've got other parts of the landscape with a much lower probability of ignition that could be acting as a barrier to the spread of fire. And this sort of map could be useful for having a more detailed understanding of how fire risk varies across the landscape. In contrast, a couple of days later, we're seeing a very different story. So here we've got a day of total fire ban, and it's red all across the landscape. So a high probability of ignition, even in those wetter forests in the centre of the Otways there. So this means a higher connectivity of available fuel and a higher likelihood that fires could develop to become large and more intense. How about from a planned burning application? Well, this model could be useful for that as well. Here I've picked out a burn that occurred a few years ago behind lawn. That's the black line that you can see there. And we're just tracking how the landscape dryness and the ignitability is varying in the days leading up to the burn. And this could help to choose the optimal conditions to conduct that burn to get a more patchy outcome. So you can see 3 days before the burn, perhaps too much of that burn unit is in that high probability of ignition sort of state. But as time progresses, that changes, and then the burn day, we'll zoom in onto that one. And you can see that the areas that did burn do line up fairly well with areas that had a higher probability of ignition on that day. What you might notice, though, is not all the areas that had a high probability of ignition burnt. And that's an interesting thing and something we're grappling with now, because the next stage in our analysis is trying to predict burn patchiness. So can we produce maps to predicting what areas are most likely to burn on a particular day before we actually light the burn? And this is heavily influenced by your probability of ignition, but as you saw in that map before, not always lining up with the probability of ignition, because there's other factors coming into play here. Possibly soil moisture, which could influence how much of the litter bed is available to burn. But then there's also human factors like the ignition strategy that's really hard to capture in modelling, and then topographic factors as well. So this is the next stage that we're focusing on with our research. And I'd be interested to discuss this with anyone if you have ideas of other variables we should consider here. So in summary, thresholds for ignition vary between forest types, with the wetter forests needing drier air to ignite. We've shown that in-forest VPD and ignitability can be modelled across landscapes at quite high resolution, and this could be useful for assessing bushfire risk, identifying windows that are best for burning, and also predicting burn patchiness, which might feed into risk models in the future. If you'd like to know more, please come up and chat to me later or come and ask questions now. We have a few papers that we've published as well on this. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jane. Any questions? MRK up there. Or Anmark. Ooh, 2. Don't know about that.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Terrific. Currently in the Eastern Otways, Alcoa are going through a rehabilitation of the coal mine, and I found out with recent submissions on groundwater use that they've intersected a superficial aquifer there that's bleeding into the mine pit. It would probably be wise to consider the influence of human abstraction and the effects on superficial aquifers, coupled with your vapor pressure deficit, to understand how much stress that bush is under at any one time. So I guess that's just a comment. And have you read widely with groundwater abstraction and its influence on fire behaviours? Is there anything in the literature that you've seen about that?
Probably it probably would be influencing mostly your live fuel moisture content, would be my guess, which is the moisture content of the living plants in that system. And there are some studies that have linked that to fire behaviour, but they're not they're not conclusive. There's a bit of debate about how important live fuel moisture is to fire behaviour. It's mostly the dead fuel moisture that's the key driver.
And one from Mike.
Thank you. Really good. I'm interested in the differences between, say, smoothbark eucalypts, say manigum and regnans, where they drop a lot of fuel down into the on the ground, as opposed to things like messmate, brown stringy bark, peppermint, that have a very flammable trunk but don't drop a lot in the ground. Whether that could influence some of the unpredictability of where fire goes.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because in our initial field work we did, where we were looking at ignitability, we sort of found that the fuel structure wasn't having an influence on the ignitability, but it could be important in terms of the fire continuing to propagate and therefore influencing the burn patchiness. So it could be something that we can look into, some measures of fuel structure, which would be easy to add in. But yeah, I suspect it could have, definitely in terms of stringy bark and its influence on spotting, that could be something that's like driving the fire in certain areas.
Thanks so much, Jane.